listening to the History of Aviation podcast with Derrick Beeler, David Rowe, and David Gorman.
This episode of the History of Aviation podcast is brought to you by True Comfort Heat and Air. Veteran-owned and operated True Comfort Heat and Air. More information in the description below. Hello, friends, and welcome to the History of Aviation podcast, episode number 55. Thanks for making us a part of your day. I'm Derrick Beeler, and joined first off by Mr. David Rowe. How's it going, David?
Oh, it's doing great. Glad to be here. It's been an exciting day for me. Finally got to catch a KC-135 refueling a P-8. Usually I just see P-8s in the pattern at Tri-Cities Airport, but today I got to see one being refueled. And then about 5 hours later, I saw a P-8 in the pattern at Tri. So today was my P-8 day. But yeah, good day and glad to be here.
And I'm also joined by Mr. Dave Gorman. How's it going, Dave?
Doing great. Did not have any P-8 action. Did have a C-32 that was in the pattern for a while today. So the iconic white and blue of the presidential fleet doing some touch and goes out of, I guess, Andrews Air Force Base is where they came out of and were over Knoxville for a while. So that was pretty cool to see. Didn't go out and take any pictures, but it was flying right over my house, which conveniently is on the flight path. Worked out well.
I love it. What a great airplane we got here, one that set some records back in the day.
Well, this is one of those transitional aircraft that it actually has a cousin that is probably a lot more familiar to people nowadays, but the P-80 was a early jet aircraft that had some success in the Korean War, and we're going to talk about how it came to be an iconic early frontline jet fighter aircraft for the U.S. Air Force and other air forces around the world.
Absolutely. It's sort of the grandfather of all the jets today. It started the line. It was America's first successful turbojet powered aircraft. And it wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the best, but it was the first in service.
Well, there's something to be said for that. And, the design of this aircraft was, a closely guarded secret and everything at the time it was being developed. Still in the middle of World War II, and was another one of these aircraft that was kind of rushed through production. What was it, 150 days or something like that? From design until first flight, which is just amazing to think about all the new technology that was happening, and to get something like that from design into flight is in that amount of time is pretty amazing.
Well, it is, but fear of your enemy will do that to you, because this is the one time when America was not in the lead in aviation. Jet-powered aircraft, the Germans were far ahead, the British were not far behind them, and then here we are trying to play catch up. But luckily, we had a really, really good person involved in Mr. Kelly Johnson, who made some promises and kept his promises. And like you said, it was 143 days from when they said they'd make one till they produced one. So that, for a first jet that, was going to, unknown from, the ground up, basically, they really knocked it out of the park.
Well, anytime that Kelly Johnson's involved in the design of an aircraft, I mean, this is a guy who was an absolute giant of American aerospace. Guy using slide rules and, kind of went by the rule that, hey, if it looked good, it'll fly. He was involved in the design of so many iconic American aircraft from the F-104 and the SR-71, the U-2. Just incredible width and breadth, P-38 width and breadth of his designs, and an amazing designer. So we could dedicate an entire show to that guy. But this early jet was, as you said, we were playing catch up, and catch up we did. It did not see any service in World War II, any action in combat, of course, but it did service in the Korean War just a few years later, right?
Well, correct. It did serve in World War II in Italy for apparently 2 missions that to this day, we don't have the full details of what they did. Apparently, from what I was reading, the Germans were using their Blitz bomber, which was another jet that they had built for reconnaissance. And reading between the lines from what I was reading, we sent these jets where there were 4 that were sent to Europe, 2 to England and 2 to Italy. The 2 in Italy were there to possibly shoot down that jet reconnaissance Blitz bomber that they were using. But like I said, there were 2 missions that if they flew on, but what they did or what the results were, nobody seems to know. So
well, I think you gotta believe that if they were successful, we'd know about it. So,
well, I think you're exactly right. That
yeah.
They were sent there in the hopes that they could be useful, but the opportunity never arose.
So it did bide its time, and development continued, and then did see some frontline service in the Korean War, where it was already kind of outclassed and with that straight wing design that it had, but it did have some success in the air to air and ground attack role that it served in Korea. Correct?
Yes, it did. It was both an interceptor and a ground attack aircraft. It was multi-purpose. With that big nose in the front, it's loaded with some pretty heavy 50 caliber machine guns, and they could absolutely do some damage on the ground and in the air with the aircraft.
And it did indeed. So, the pilots that flew this aircraft, a lot of them had been propeller pilots who trained and came up through World War II in propeller aircraft. So this was a big transition for them, just in terms of handling and speed and everything, right?
Yeah, that's, as a matter of fact, that was one of the things I was reading about. The very first test pilot, when he flew the very first plane, and later he crashed and was killed because of the new technology. There was a fuel pump that they had to put a second one in, and he wasn't aware that there was a second one. So when his plane quit, he didn't know he could switch over to another fuel pump. The same thing happened to Major Bong, who was the top ace of World War II with 40 kills. He was flying was making a delivery flight. And apparently he just forgot that it had an extra fuel pump, and he didn't turn it on, and the plane flamed out and crashed, and he didn't survive that. So this was a new aircraft with new processes. One of the things they said is it was hard to tell how fast they were going because they didn't have that big engine in front making all that noise. So when you throttled up, you heard a big, increase in the noise, the propeller beating the wind, you could hear that, you could tell. With the jet, you literally had to read your instruments. So this is all new for all those World War II guys. They have to relearn how they're flying and trust their instruments. And, it was some teething problems, but, like everything else, over time, they worked it all out.
You always heard about the response when they would push the throttle forward. A lot of these jets were really slow to respond. I mean, you did not want to get behind the power curve and in need of a big increase in speed, because it would take a while for that engine to spool up and respond.
That primary, yeah, exactly. The piston engine propeller plane, you press the throttle, you get an instant result. And with these, it would take seconds, and seconds mean, altitude and stall and all these other factors start becoming really important to you. So yes, that was high on the new things that had to be learned, was just how to manage the systems in the aircraft.
Well, and I thought it was interesting because before this plane saw fighter service in Korea, there were different developments of it that were used as racers or used as high-speed test aircraft. I mean, they really were committed to this type of aircraft. I mean, there were other transitional turboprop type aircraft that were still being developed, but we really were trying to focus on the jets, and so this was a design that saw a lot of refinement and an effort to get the most out of those engines and get the most out of the speed and the design and everything, but still a straight wing aircraft by the time of the Korean War, right?
Right. And that ultimately was one of the things that held it back from becoming a great, fighter aircraft is, it's basically a World War II design with a jet engine in it. Whereas in Korea, when it met up with this new plane called the MiG-15 with its swept wings and, its much higher speed, it just wasn't competitive. And so they had to withdraw them from, frontline combat in favor of the F-86 Sabre, which was definitely a good match to the MiG-15. But like I said, it was still a good ground attack aircraft. So it stuck around throughout the Korean War as a ground attack aircraft. So after the F-86 became dominant, you could still find that F-80 doing its thing, busting up troops and ground.
Pretty important role that it played and development. But when you think about this aircraft, one of the main developments that came out of it, of course, was the T-33, the trainer version of this, which was notably different in that it was a two-seater, and so if you see a plane that looks like this, it's flying today, it's always a T-33, or it could be a Canadian built model, but an awful lot of pilots learned to fly jets in the trainer version of the P-80, didn't they?
Yes, they sure did. They made a two-seat version of the P-80, and that became the new thing. It was larger, like you said, because it has two people in it. It was just a bigger, better aircraft. It was more capable, and they really ran with it because the P-80, they only built about 1,700 of them. But that T-33, they built over 6,557. So there are a lot of T-33s out there still today. There's a Ace Maker still on the air show circuit. You can see that plane fly today at an air show.
Yeah, Greg Collier, I think
Correct.
is the name of that guy, and we see him up in Louisville sometimes. He's puts on a great show. Now there were other versions of the P-80 though that flew. I mean, there was a photo recon version that saw some use in Korea too, correct?
Yes, that was the other. I believe there were 5 wings of P-80s as fighter interceptor bombers, and then there was one that was reconnaissance, and the one reconnaissance made it all the way through Korea. I believe at the end of the war, it was basically the last P-80 group that was still there. But with that big nose, they put a glass enclosure on the nose with some big cameras, and it's a perfect platform for reconnaissance. And again, it's faster than at that time we still had Mustangs and Corsairs and Yaks and Aleutian aircraft, post World War II aircraft that were still hanging around. So they couldn't catch it. It was just the MiGs they had to worry about.
Well, head to head, how did this aircraft, the P-80, did it hold its own against the MiG-15?
In a good pilot's hands, yes, but ultimately the speed difference is just too great. I mean, I think there's almost 100, no, it was like 80 miles an hour difference. And that, the MiG can turn so much faster with those swept wings. So it's just not a fair fight ultimately.
That really made a difference. And so there were a lot more P-80s lost in combat than MiGs.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I think it was 277 were lost in Korea. Let me see where my note says. There were 277 F-80s lost in operations. 113 were lost to ground fire, 14 to enemy aircraft, and 54 to unknown losses.
Yeah.
And then there were like 96 that were other losses, which could be anything from wrecks to just broken down or whatever. And the F-80s were credited with destroying 17 aircraft, air-to-air, and 24 on the ground. And as a matter of fact, it is the Russians and the Americans both claim to be the first to shoot down a jet-to-jet. The Russians did it on the 1st of November and said they shot down one of our F-80s. And then on the 8th of November, we said we shot down one of their MiGs. And both sides claim it, but we can't prove it one way or the other.
Well, that would be a historical first, so it makes sense that both sides will want to say they were the first to do it.
Exactly.
The Korean War was known as much as, the weather and the conditions and what it was like to do battle in some pretty brutal working conditions, living conditions, fighting conditions, everything. But then to throw into that the new technology, the jets and everything else, you really had to be a pretty well-oiled machine to keep your machines well-oiled and fit and fighting and everything. So, when you're talking about the number of aircraft lost, some of that may have just been, the ability to keep these aircraft in service too.
Yeah, absolutely. Things break, combat conditions, you repair it and, maybe the repair isn't 100%. So you never know.
Right.
But,
now you mentioned about the 50s in the nose. And so as a gun platform, this aircraft had guns, not in the wings, but in the nose, correct?
Right. They were all center mounted. One of the things I read was by putting all the weapons in the nose, that allowed them to have much thinner wings. So you didn't have to have a big, thick wing to house all that ammunition and the guns themselves. So that helped with the streamlining and the speed of the aircraft, kept it nice and slick. It came with 650 caliber M3 Browning machine guns with 300 rounds per gun. It also could carry eight 127 millimeter HVAR unguided rockets and 2 1,000-pound bombs. So, it could carry a little bit of a punch.
So ground attack was a role that it was also well suited for.
Absolutely. I think they planned it that way. We're definitely going to make it a dual use aircraft.
And those were ground attack missiles. Those HFAR, was it high velocity aerial rockets?
I think
was what that stood for. So those were not air to air. Those were not for taking out other aircraft. They weren't guided in that sense, but they were just line up, point and shoot type of a thing for ground attack.
Exactly. Yeah, that's definitely air to air was a few years down the road.
But now you mentioned earlier about the number of aircraft that also served in the Korean War that were propeller driven. I mean, we had Sky Raiders and Corsairs and there were even some some F-51s that were fighting. The F-82s were it was really transitional period. So and this was not the only jet that saw service in for the U.S. Air Force in Korea as well. We had the F-86 that came out, which was a swept wing aircraft that really was kind of a iconic aircraft of the Korean War. But this was first. This was the early one, and held its own as best as it could until some of those technologies were able to catch up.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the P-40 and the P-51. The P-40 was there and available at the beginning of World War II, but it was the P-51 that finished it. Same here. The F-80 was there at the beginning of the war. It was available, and they used it as best they could. And then when the better plane came along, which was that F-86 Sabre, it took over that interceptor role of taking out the MiGs.
Absolutely. And it's always been interesting to me when you think about the Korean War. There weren't a lot of those pilots were not necessarily Korean pilots. A lot of them were Russian pilots who probably had flown American aircraft like the P-39s and P-63s and even B-25s perhaps in World War II. And here they are fighting a proxy war on behalf of the Koreans flying MiG-15s.
Right. Yeah. Well, and here I just saw the F-80s, they were 594 miles per hour. The MiG-15s were 668 miles per hour. So that's, significant.
Yeah, incredible difference there.
Yeah. So, I mean, MiG can come in, shoot, and get away before the F-80 could, get turned around to, defend itself. That's just, like I said, it wasn't a fair fight. But, if you're a good pilot, you can make any aircraft deadly.
Well, did we at that time, Dave? Did we have uh, the ability with radar interception and things like that? We didn't have AWACS type aircraft that were out surveying and trying to pick up waves of MiGs that were in attack formation, things like that. Were they just up searching for aircraft and looking for aircraft that were taken off, or were there?
No, I think there was radar involved, but I think it was all ground stations. I'm trying to think if there was anything that was airborne. I think it was all ground related.
That was coming soon. I don't know if we had it certainly at the beginning of the war. That's for sure.
Right. Yeah. No, I don't recall exactly, but I don't remember that being a thing that was readily available.
Now, you mentioned that there were some MiGs that were shot down by the F-80s, P-80s actually at this point, right?
Well, no, by the time they were in the Korean War, they were F-80s.
They were F-80s. Okay.
Yeah, because when it went in the Army, United States Army Air Force, when it switched to the Air Force themselves as a separate branch, that is when it went from the P-80 to the F-80.
To the F-80.
Yeah, so everything that the Air Force had was designated F for fighter as opposed to P for pursuit with the Army.
That changed with things like the F-51, the P-51 became the F-51, right?
Exactly. So
Gotcha.
It's just the same aircraft. It's just a name designation for the different service.
That was important. Well, you mentioned that there were some MiGs shot down by the F-80s. Were there any aces? Were there any F-80 aces?
There were not. I looked that up specifically because I'm thinking, I don't remember reading about any F-80 aces. It's always F-86. The only one that I could find on this list that I found was a gentleman by the name of Frederick Boots Blessey, who's a pretty famous World War II fighter pilot. He flew 223 combat missions in the F-51, the F-80, and the F-86 in the Korean War. Now, that was over 2 tours. The first tour was in the F-51 and the F-80. Apparently, he did not shoot anything down in that tour. But when he came back for his second tour in the F-86, he got 10 kills, 9 MiG-15s and 1 LA-9. So there was an ace who flew the F-80, but he didn't get any kills in the F-80. It was all in the F-86 later.
Well, Boots Blessey is, certainly a name we've heard before, but I was not aware of anybody having that much success in the F-80.
Now, that the things that I was reading, that they were shooting down the Yaks and the Aleutian, the World War II aircraft that were still fighting, that they had an advantage over because they were 100 miles an hour faster. Yeah, but not for the MiGs. The MiGs were just a little bit tough.
They gave up way too much in that regard, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Absolutely.
Well, what were some of the targets that the F-80 was used against? We mentioned about the ground attack ability, and you said it carried a couple of bombs and those rockets. What type of targets was it used to attack?
Well, here I've got a great story here. There is one Medal of Honor that was earned in an F-80. This was by a Charles Loring Jr. He was a fighter pilot in the Air Force, and he earned the Medal of Honor on November the 22nd, 1952 in Kunwa, Korea. So let me back up and tell you on this. He fought in World War II, was a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, and he was shot down and served 6 months in a German prison. So he had prior experience in World War II as a pilot and as a prisoner. So they were sent out to attack a Chinese artillery position. So I think that's what this aircraft was really there for, was supporting the troops, taking out the artillery that was attacking the Allied or the coalition. What were they called back then? Either way.
It was a NATO. I mean,
Right.
it was the UN forces, that
The
NATO.
UN forces. That's
UN.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So anyway, they were sent out to attack this artillery position. So he goes to this. There were 4 airplanes. He goes in, and he had been warned that there was anti-aircraft at this location. And sure enough, those Chinese were pretty sharp, and they shot his plane full of holes. And this is the interesting part. This is where he's earned his Medal of Honor. Is so during the air run, the aircraft was struck by intense and accurate anti-aircraft fire. Rather than abort the mission, Loring continued his diving run, aiming his disabled aircraft at the position and obliterating it, killing himself in the process. So essentially, he went kamikaze and took it out. And but at the same time, I was thinking about this earlier, that he had experience as a prisoner of war. And I wonder if maybe the thought of him being captured and put in prison again was just more than he wanted to face. And this was the best way to solve the problem, because, he's got a plane that he can't fly and he doesn't want to become a prisoner. And so he just decided to eliminate the position.
Took it in.
Yeah.
And of course, Loring Air Force Base, I guess, was named in his honor.
That is exactly right. In Limestone, Maine, they named it for him.
Goodness.
So, but yeah, that was really interesting. So yeah, I think artillery troops on the ground, sort of like what the Sky Raider would do in Vietnam.
Absolutely. There was a time, I don't know, in the last couple of years, I suppose, with just realizing some of those bases named for people. You start reading about some of the bases you've heard of, and you're like, oh man, these are all honoring people who at times early pioneers and people that made ultimate sacrifices. So we do honor Loring for his sacrifice and this as an early pioneer in a mission that he gave his life in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it was in, these early aircraft. So, they were doing the best they had with what they had.
Well, we mentioned about, that this was an aircraft that saw service in the U.S. Did it have service with some other countries?
Absolutely. It was used in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Uruguay, and Yugoslavia, I believe. They were around. There were several around. Matter of fact, I think Chile and Brazil and Uruguay all have an F-80 on display in their countries. So they still exist in those places.
And some of those are still being flown into the 60s and 70s, I think, still in some frontline service.
Yes, that is correct. Who was it? Was it Bolivia? Flew it into like 1974, But again, we were flying the T-33, which is the bigger cousin, up until the 2000s, 90s.
There were still pilots. There's still pilots flying today who trained in the T-33 and as Air Force pilots. That's for sure.
Right. Yeah. So it's had a long history, and it's made a mark for itself.
Pretty classic design. Now, I did want to mention the Sea Star, which I thought was interesting. That there was a variant of this that saw Navy service as well, right?
That is correct. The Navy wanted to use it, and so they got their hands on a few, put some arresting hooks on it, and they actually put them on a carrier deck and tested it, and it worked. And they ended up purchasing several for training purposes. I don't think it ever was used as in combat. It was just basically for training purposes. But yes, the Navy definitely found a use for this aircraft.
Well, anytime you have an aircraft that sees multi-service different branches of the military, it's a pretty good sign of its success.
Right. Yeah. Here's the interesting thing. So I was talking about they went out and tested it. Well, the person that tested it was Marine Major Marion Carl, who is another World War II ace.
Absolutely, he was. My goodness. Yeah. So he was the one that landed on the carrier.
Yeah, that's correct. The USS Franklin D. Roosevelt in Norfolk, Virginia, in 31st of October, 1946, made 4 deck run takeoffs, 2 catapult launches, and 5 arrested landings. So this guy was, test pilot central right there.
Well, I know our buddy Bruce could tell me exactly what he flew. I know he was either a Hellcat or a Wildcat pilot. I can't remember which one, but I think for going from that off a carrier to a modified P-80 T-33 Sea Star jet takeoff off a carrier, that's pretty good in just a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Those guys were, steel, man. They were made of steel is what they were.
Absolutely. But, again, this is a transitional aircraft. It served at a time when things were still very much in doubt in the war in Europe and around the world. And, the technology was, we were still catching up to a lot of things. And we didn't have all the information about jet engines yet and the value of swept wings. That was still to come. But, as an aircraft that was pressed into service in just a very short amount of time, the design was solid. It served us well, didn't it?
Absolutely. One of the things we forgot to mention, the engines in it, they are British originally. The first the P-80, it was a British engine. We had to borrow an engine from a Vampire that they were building in England just to have the engines because we were so far behind the curve there. We ultimately built some Allison engines to replace it, but I mean, we were relying on other people to get us started. And this was the plane that, played the part of getting us into the game and certainly made a mark for itself.
Definitely worthy of honor and one that, worthy of our respect. And you think about those guys that gave their lives in testing this plane and putting it through its paces, all the honor to them as well.
Absolutely.
That is definitely for sure, guys. And as we're talking here on episode number 55 of the History of Aviation podcast, David Rowe, you've got in your background here is a photo you took for Aerophile.
Yes, it is. That is an F-80 that's at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. You can go and walk around and get some really up-close photos of it. It's a beautiful airplane, and it's in Dayton, Ohio right now. That's on my Aerophile website. You can go check it out there with all the other aircraft that I shot while I was there.
What else do you have going on update-wise? What we got looking in the future for Aerophile?
Well, I have just completed uploading a boatload of photos to my Facebook, Aerophile Facebook page, a whole bunch of pictures from my vacation time trip. On my website, Aerophile website, I have just uploaded all the photos from the Military Museum of North Florida. And I'm in the process of adding captions. But if you just want to see the pictures of what the museum looked like, it's available on my Aerophile website in the miscellany section. So come check me out.
I like it. Dave Gorman getting ready to go on vacation here.
Got a trip coming up to the Outer Banks this week, which is always a good time. I'll go by and pay my respects to Wilbur and Orville.
There you go.
As I like to do. And hopefully get a trip up to the Virginia Aviation Museum up in Pungo, Virginia, pretty close to the Norfolk area. Go see our buddy Zach Bachman up there if all goes well. And looking forward to that as well. They've got some great aircraft there, but a lot of historical aircraft on display and a whole bunch of them fly. So always worth a good trip. I was listening to what Dave was saying there about you take all those pictures and then you want to share them with people, but going through and doing the research and captioning everything. I mean, that's half the fun as well, but you like people to know what they're looking at there, so always good.
Well, half of the problem is there's a lot of vehicles that this museum has, and I took photos, but there either wasn't a placard or I didn't take a picture of the placard. And now I'm guessing as to what what kind of Jeep is that? I've got 3 photos of 3 different Jeeps. Well, that's like, is that a P-51B or a C or a D, which one? So that's what I'm working through right now is, identifying all the different things that I saw.
Well, that's what research is. Thank God we have the internet to help us with that, right?
Absolutely. Couldn't imagine digging through books trying to find it today.
Good
That'd
Lord,
be
no.
something else, wouldn't it?
Well, that's how we used to do it.
Yeah, really. And the History of Aviation podcast. Gosh, Dave Gorman, we got all kinds of stuff going on. We got the Facebook page, we got the website, the Facebook.
We're out there on Instagram, perhaps Twitter. We got all kinds of ways for you to communicate with us and let us know what you're interested in, questions you may have for us, or comments on what we talk about. Corrections, always look forward to hearing your thoughts about what we have to say. So lots of ways to connect with us too.
Yeah, definitely always welcome. And folks have been asking, where can I listen to the podcast? Well, obviously, if you're listening to it, but if you know somebody that don't know, our website, and we're on all podcast platforms.
Yeah, History of Aviation. Look us up.
Yeah.
Share
absolutely.
with your friends.
And I want to mention we're promoting Julian Martinson's book. Dave, I think it's the ultimate guide to careers in aviation. I think you got a copy for the classroom, right?
I think I got one coming. I'm looking forward to reading that. And it sure was great talking to him a couple of weeks ago and hearing about all the ways that you can get involved in a career in aviation, from maintenance to being that guy who was pushed all the buttons and pulling back on the yoke. So all kinds of ways to get involved. And he's got a book that tells you how you could do that. So
yeah, exactly. So if there's any young folks that want to get into aviation, I'll have all of Julian Martinson's information in the description below, as well as David Rowe's information, Dave Gorman, and as well as the History of Aviation podcast information. I enjoyed it, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. What a great plane. And episode 55, man, they go fast, don't they?
Rolling on.
Yeah, we are moving on.
Maybe not as fast as a MiG-15, but we do okay.
We'll catch up eventually.
Absolutely.
For David Rowe, Dave Gorman, I'm Derrick Beeler. Thanks for listening to the History of Aviation podcast.
This is Joe Morse. You are listening to the History of Aviation podcast with Derrick Beeler, David Rowe, and David Gorman.
And that's it, folks. Thanks for listening. We hope you learned something new, and have a great day.